Easily the most divisive and polarizing topic of discussion when it comes to Fire Emblem Engage is Alear's hair and the game's art style. Uttering them or the game right now will 9 times out of 10 result in someone commentating their thoughts whether such choices are ugly or not. I do feel like sharing my stance on the game's art and story direction and hopefully provide perspective of how the game looks from a series veteran. This is a smaller, more editorial type of video, but there's been quite a bit of discourse and I kind of feel like weighing in a little bit, even if my take is still relatively lukewarm. To answer the immediate question, do I like Alear's character design? I do in fact, but unsurprisingly not completely. Surprising nobody, I'm not a fan of the hair and eyes, but everything else to me is fine. I find the design below the neck solid. It's regal, flashy, cool, and cohesive. The problem I personally have with the hair, I think there would have been better ways to work with the red and blue bicolor. Red and blue are pretty contrasting colors, but so is blonde and this shade of blue, which is seemingly called Blue Marguerite, which Constance von Nouvelle from 3 Houses and 3 Hopes makes work by having the blue hair underneath and solidly blended with the blonde curls in her time skip design. There's a precedent for how this hairdo could work in Fire Emblem, and I'm just partial to see something like that instead. Or even the ombre gradient-like stuff in Fire Emblem Heroes' OCs. Heterochromia is something I don't really like ever. I think generally it's tacky and corny, but I'm less against this case just because of how non-edgy the overall character and design of Alear is. If you gave heterochromia to an edgelord like Felix, then I would call it very corny. In this case though, it's just kind of innocuous, so it's a whatever sort of situation for me. I can understand the sentiment behind the maybe their hair is that way because they're half dragon stance, which, I mean, maybe that is the reason. But it's not like this series is a stranger to two-toned hair, let alone half dragon children. You could strike the best of both worlds there, in fact you have with Lilith. And for what it's worth, Mika Pikazo, the character designer, enjoys this style, and clearly Intelligent Systems does as well. This is to say that going out and harassing Pikazo over Alear's design is very dumb and misdirected. She was hired to do a job, and as far as her bosses are concerned, it was a job well done. So yeah, overall, it's alright. I'm pretty impartial to it just because the design isn't 100% bad. There's just aspects of it that I like and that I don't like. As for the general art direction with the rest of the cast, I can't say. There isn't enough characters shown in detail yet. But I'm also impartial because art and Fire Emblem are one of those things you ought to expect to drastically vary between sagas of Fire Emblem games. And generally these changes are meant to appeal to the changing preferences and sensibilities of the times. You can look at the end of the Kaga era into the GBA era, where the art style heel turned from the gritty, dark, and relatively, it's still anime, grounded character designs and sprites. FE6 became much more saturated and cartoonish with brighter and more vibrant tile sets, though in its defense, the GBA didn't have a way to brighten the screen like modern handhelds do at launch. Not to mention, the gameplay was greatly simplified, removing skills altogether and streamlining chapter goals to just seize or defeat boss, to name a few. And I'd wager there was also a portion of Kaga-era fans back in the day that didn't like the drastic art and gameplay choices made for FE6. With the series on the line, Kohei Maeda, the new director from then on, went all out and, like in FE6, attempted to appeal to as wide of a crowd as possible, alongside streamlined gameplay, which FE6 did compared to FE5 as well. FE Awakening did a similar sweeping change compared to Radiant Dawn, and while it worked, not everyone was on board with it. Awakening was canned for being too anime in style, and it was particularly criticized over its over-reliance on anime tropes being the driving force behind character writing. Fate's criticism related to this was really hardcore given the fact that face petting was a feature. The waifuification of Fire Emblem was a very popular subject to talk about, and even I was a huge hater of Fate's heavier focus on fan service from hot springs to my room shenanigans to its sexualized characters. Three Houses was/is criticized for its art style being even more basic, bright, and anime than past iterations. It being a derivative of Persona in style and in gameplay mechanics is also a common complaint. And now, Fire Emblem Engage is faced with the very same criticism. Whether it's too bright or colorful, too anime, too pandering to modern trends, and so on. I have seen the defense of Engage's art style take the following form of, but Fire Emblem was always anime. Like, yeah, sure, the series has always adopted an anime aesthetic in some capacity, but I find this defense not only is missing the point of why people are complaining, but also oversimplifies their complaints so as to be able to dismiss them. These are, in fairness to the criticism, very noticeably different stylistic changes, and by nature will cause divisiveness, given that some people are just more partial to muted, grounded, and realistic, and I use the last term lightly, art styles from the past. Binding Blade is radically different from Thracia 776. Awakening is radically different from Radiant Dawn. Three Houses is radically different from Fates. If someone likes Kozaki's character designs more than Pikazo's, then there's nothing more to say. It's part of the cycle at this point. So now, from the outside looking in, I find it comedic that people are now starting to compare Engage's art style with Kozaki's and Kurohana's, pointing fingers to them and saying, look at how bad it is compared to this, when those games came out, the very same criticism was applied against them. And look, I was there, bro. Just reminds me of my young 20s, burning with anger over my castle. Presentation is obviously important, but at its core, a Fire Emblem game is a turn-based strategy RPG with an expectation of fleshed-out, diverse characters with important relationships among each other for us to learn, and an expectation of a story that takes itself seriously. If there are people who want to skip out on this entry because of the visuals and premise of the story, that's an understandable position to have, but it has only been one trailer in 4 days. There is no doubt in my mind that the game has yet to show its full hand, especially given that we barely know anything about what else the game has to offer in terms of its mechanics or characters. With regards to expectations outside of the aesthetic, Fire Emblem Engage does have incredibly deep boots to fill. The Fodlan era had incredibly rich lore, an absolutely incredible cast of characters, and very good gameplay. It is among my favorite Fire Emblem games for a reason. Engage is faced with an exceptionally tall task of comparing to the likes of their Three Houses counterparts, both in terms of story and characters. Gameplay-wise, it looks like it will do very well. And given that the premise of this story is quite, traditional for Fire Emblem, it will be tough. But that said, while Three Houses, and Fates to an extent, had these assets, execution was a problem for both games for different reasons. Not to spoil anything since we're not going there, but if you know, you know. Don't get me wrong. Three Houses had very good stories, and personally, I don't think people give Verdant Wind enough credit, but its pacing, tendency to cut corners, and habit of leaving way too much unexplained held it back from being truly legendary. And a complex story and world on paper doesn't automatically mean it will be pulled off in practice. Conversely, a simple story premise can be incredibly well executed. Thracia 776's premise is very straightforward, but has so many high tension and heartbreaking moments around Leaf. It's just so incredible and memorable. Blazing Sword, while not the greatest in execution, is carried by the Alear trio, with Hector and Eliwood's journeys of personal growth being so absolutely fantastically done. Especially Hector. Sacred Stones has a very simple MacGuffin story on paper, but oh my gosh, the theme of loss and corruption in that story, and the many moments with the villains are so memorable. Orson is my favorite villain in the series, and he came from that game. I know the above statements lack context since I'm not spoiling anything, and I'm not explaining why I feel these ways about these stories. I have in the past in my other videos at least, but hey, maybe you already agree. So far, I do have one concern, okay, maybe two, about the Emblem Rings. If series antagonists show up, I'll be very curious how the villains will be executed. It seems to me like the Emblem heroes will have agency and things to say in the story, and it's understandable that heroes would willfully aid Alear and friends stop the bad guys from winning. But is the same true for the series antagonists? Take Ashnard from Path of Radiance. Why the heck should he care to help anyone else? Would Leon, not possessed by the Demon King be capable of assisting some villain in doing harm? Will they provide a storyline more nuanced than something we would expect out of Fire Emblem Heroes? Or will they rely on simply the Demon King? On the flip side, I really hope they don't just throw in the heroes of series past as merely a gameplay mechanic and not as actual characters. And I also hope generally that there are a lot of rings to wear, if you know what I mean. But I digress. Interesting stuff to think about, but ultimately, it's more so just pointless and errant speculation until we learn more about the game. This has been my opinion piece on the direction Engage has shown us thus far. Sharing my thoughts on Engage and Alear discourse is something I wanted to do, and I'm glad I have an avenue like this to talk about it on. Now I'll pose the following questions to you. What are you concerned or excited for with Engage? Do you like Alear's character design? What about the art direction as a whole? Let me know in the comments below. Finally, a massive thank you to everyone who has recently subscribed and everyone who watches my content every time when I publish something. This may be the last video on the channel, finally, after 6 or so years, before the channel surpasses 100,000 subscribers. It's something I can't really wrap my head around right now. It's still very, very wild. All the same, if you liked this video and you haven't subscribed yet, but you've been seeing my videos pop up in your recommended tab, please consider doing so. With that all said, enjoy your week, and until next time, deuces.